Why Isn't Becky Twitchel Dead? A Tom and Scott Mystery, Book 2. Author Mark Richard Subro. Publisher St. Martin's Press, New York. Narrator Eric Ost. Chapter 5. Scott promised to call the public defender to see whether his status or prestige or name recognition might get them to act more quickly in getting bail for Jeff. The bitter cold ripped through my clothes as I ran from my car to the school another day when the high temperature might not get above zero. Carolyn Blackburn met me at the school door. "We've got a problem," she said. She walked me to my classroom. The door lay splintered in the hallway. A blizzard of chaos covered every inch of the room. "The janitors discovered the break-in first thing this morning. They called the police and me. Someone vandalized your room and my office. The custodian started cleaning my office when the police left a half hour ago. They'll start in here next." I had the same feeling of loss and vulnerability you get when your home is broken into. Carolyn stood in the doorway as I toured the wreckage. On the blackboard, someone had written, "What happened to Susan Warren can happen to you." I touched the slashed and torn bulletin boards. I straightened the one desk still whole and standing. The spines had been ripped off all the books on the shelves. The famous authors' posters, for which I'd paid $10 apiece, lay in tattered ruins. Every drawer of every file cabinet lay exposed and empty, the contents tossed tornadically around the room. Only a fool isn't frightened at the right moment. But I'd be goddamned if I'd be scared off. At first, it was helping Jeff and Mrs. Trask. One a student, the other a friend. But now it was personal. Somebody was after me. That shit I would never put up with. 2 janitors carried out the largest remnant of my desk. Carolyn and I were alone in the room. She said, "I'm going to tell you this, but if you repeat it or say it came from me, I'll deny it and call you a liar." I gave her a brief smile and nod that I understood. She walked to the window and looked out. She began speaking with her back to me. "I've taught for years. I know how school systems work, how parents and boards put pressure on us. I don't think I'm naive." She turned around. "But in my 20 years as an administrator, I've never had an experience like I've had here with the Twitchels." She shook her head. "Dad is not rational when it comes to his daughter. From him, I get angry ravings. From the mother, I get that if I don't let her up on her kid, I'll be in trouble." She sat in the one desk, looked up at me, and pounded her hand softly on the fake wood surface. "That girl needs help, as much as I've ever seen in all these years." She explained that when she'd come to Grover, Cleveland, she'd watched carefully for potential problems. Early on, she discovered Becky was one of them. She talked to people. Those who would talk told her incredible stories. In 7th grade, in front of a whole class, Becky ripped all her textbooks to shreds after receiving an F for one quiz. The girl expressed no regret or remorse for this. The next day, her parents sent her with the money for an entire new set of books. Becky's cruelties at lunchtime were legendary, picking on the most unpopular boys or girls, humiliating them, reducing them to tears. Earlier this year, a teacher tried to lead her by the elbow out of his classroom. It was after school, and he had tried to counsel her on her irrational behavior. He claims it was a harmless, caring gesture. At the instant of contact, she screamed rape and began sobbing. Carolyn shook her head. Luckily, I'd been patrolling a nearby hall, and I got there before a crowd could gather. I'll never forget that first talk with her. A 30-year-old hooker might talk like she did. Still, I detected a kid's vulnerability, not far below the surface. I managed to defuse the situation for the unfortunate teacher. Becky is poison. Carolyn had tried to check up on rumors and accusations that had followed Becky for years. The few who dared confront her with this behavior, Carolyn said, report that she seemed totally unconcerned about punishment or repercussions. Remorse seems to be the furthest thing from her mind. If a teacher did confront her, something would happen to them within 24 hours. Car windows broken, materials stolen from their classrooms, up to about 8th grade. The threat of telling her father usually had an effect. She shut her eyes and rubbed a hand across her chin, then shot me a look. My guess would be some kind of abuse from the father, physical or mental. Something. But she comes back with Mom's protection. She's got the game of playing one parent off against the other, perfected beyond any art. She's the Picasso of manipulative kids. Something is very odd and very wrong there. She drummed her fingers on the desktop. I'm stumped about what to do. She eyed me carefully, judging me on how much I could be trusted. I guessed. Then at 10 o'clock last night, I got a call from the superintendent telling me to lay off Becky Twitchel. The warning from the superintendent was clear and genuine. Leave Becky alone, and I can't possibly prove abuse. No one anywhere has reported bruises, markings. Certainly, I've never seen such a thing. In Illinois, teachers are required to report any case of suspected child abuse. Numerous times I'd reported my suspicions to the nothing come of them. The system here clanks along with as many inadequacies as anywhere else. Carolyn said, I've got a friend in the Department of Children and Family Services who I'll talk to about this, but I don't hold out much hope. She stood up. And it's my first year on this job. I'd like to keep it to retirement. I don't know how far I'm willing to go with this. She gave me a wintry smile. I read your record evaluations. You care about kids a great deal. In my limited way, I'll help you. But don't expect much. I know you don't trust me yet. No administrator could expect that. We discussed possible ramifications of my involvement. She neither encouraged nor discouraged my talking to people, saying it was my decision. She explained that her goal was to help the kid if at all possible. At least she'd been honest, a rare and valued commodity, something you didn't see in administrators very often. I told her I appreciated it. Before she left, I got her to agree to take Roger Daniels and Doris Bradford out of their classes so I could talk to them during my first period planning time. I met them in a blank-walled, gray-painted, cheerless room near the main office. The furniture consisted of a dull metal desk, matching dull metal chairs, and a black couch covered in cheap vinyl. Doris came in first. She had long black hair to her waist, a slender cheerleader who'd been elected junior prom queen the year before. She wore tight blue jeans and a Letterman sweater. I'd never had her in class. I explained to her about helping Jeff. Doris wouldn't give me even the benefit of nods and shakes of the head. I got monosyllabic mutterings and no information. After I finished with her, I might have been able to swear she'd been at Sunday's party, but not with any certainty. After 10 minutes of fruitless questioning, I asked her who she thought might have a reason to kill Susan. She finally came to life, looked at me for the first and only time during the conversation. I don't have to answer your questions. You're not a lawyer. This isn't a court. You can't make me answer. I took a stab in the dark. Is that what Becky told you? After that, she clamped her mouth firmly shut, and I didn't get even monosyllables. Roger shuffled in next, almost as wide as he was tall. He moved awkwardly. He played starting left tackle on offense and defense on the football team. His brush-cut red hair glistened. I'd taught him freshman English. Back then, Roger'd been a shorter, squatter version of his present self. I told him what I was trying to do. He squirmed in his seat, gazed at the barren gray walls, and looked over my shoulder to the parking lot outside. Finally, his eyes rested on me. He giggled. I'd never seen a 6-foot block of teenage muscle emit such an incongruous sound. I asked him what he remembered about Sunday. He hesitated, cleared his throat, gave me a pleading look. I said, Roger, what the hell is going on? Finally, he said, Mr. Mason, you've got to see what's happening. It's over the whole school about what happened to your classroom. If they can do that here in school, think what they could do to us. Who's they? I can't tell you. Come on, Roger. You know I can be trusted. I know, but all the same, I can't tell you anything. Is Becky behind all this? He looked pained and defensive and didn't answer, but I presumed I was right. Who had a reason to kill Susan? Nobody. She just hung around with us. I think the girls thought she was kind of okay. She was part of the crowd only because she dated Jeff. I asked him about the possibility of drug or alcohol abuse at the party. I got nowhere with him on that topic. The bell rang for second hour. I could learn nothing more from him at that moment, so I let him go. At noon, I called to see whether there'd been any progress in getting Jeff released. Mrs. Trask reported she'd be in court that afternoon. They'd managed to find a judge who would set a reasonable bail. I expected Eric at 4. In my restored room, I spent the time after my tutoring group left wading through a stack of senior essays on Wordsworth and Coleridge. 17 and 18-year-olds have amazingly weird notions about English romantic poetry. I was halfway through the stack when Eric walked in. He arrived precisely on time. Exceptionally lean and gawky, Eric was tall enough to be a basketball star, but uncoordinated, enough to be stuck on the bench most of the time, when he wasn't ineligible because of his grades. Since graduation last June, he'd grown a mustache. His hair, more than fashionably long and back, was often gathered into a mini ponytail. On occasion, I'd seen him sporting a diamond stud earring. His thick eyebrows formed a straight line across his face, on which an ocean of zits mixed with scraggly wisps of beard. He dumped his winter hat, coat, and gloves on a chair, along with his gym bag. He draped himself into a front row seat. He wore designer jeans and a tight silk shirt. He'd obviously changed from his mechanic's work clothes. He moved his ass to the edge of the seat, planted his feet wide apart, and crossed his arms over his bony chest. He'd driven my car over. I offered him a ride home, but he said he'd stop at basketball practice and get a ride with one of the guys. That out of the way, he said, Jeff didn't kill her. I could understand a brother standing up for his own, but he sounded absolutely definite. Who did? Beats the hell out of me. Jeff may be a good athlete, tough and all, but he's got the soul of a nerd and the heart of a wimp. Every time we wanted to do stuff, he'd wimp out. Like if me, Paul, and Roger wanted to go cruising to pick up girls, Jeff wouldn't go along. Said Susan was his girl, and that was it. We were doing it just for fun. Nobody ever got lucky, but you never know, you might. His grin revealed uneven teeth. I'd say he was pretty much by himself. He hung around with us, but he said the least. What about his temper? We had fights, all brothers do, he shrugged. He loses it pretty quick at games, that's all. That doesn't sound wimpy to me. Yeah, it is. He loses his temper over crybaby stuff. He only makes the rest mad. He sees the college and NBA guys do it on TV, and he thinks it's okay. It's Bush League bullshit. How was he Sunday? His usual self? All he did was try to get Susan to leave early. We all ragged at him about it. He got kind of mad. He and Paul almost got into it. Nothing came of it. They sort of wrestled for a minute, but they ended up laughing. Eric talked for a few minutes about Jeff's performance on the basketball court. Jeff was an above-average player, except when his father showed up. His dad tended to yell and carry on, causing his son to freeze on the court. Soon after Dad would start, Jeff lost his temper over something in the game. Eric said, I don't see the big deal about being yelled at. Montini does it all every game on the bench. We used to laugh behind his back. On the court, the starters ignore him. I guess Jeff can tune out the coach, but it's hard to ignore my dad. He's such a pig. Eric laughed. Montini used to yell at me because I'm 6'8", and I think he had visions of state championships with me as a center, but I'm a klutz and stupid. It took him a couple years to get used to that. Your mom said Coach Wyndham called. He looked surprised and guilty. That was to see if he could help Jeff. All my teacher instincts told me he lied. I wished I knew why. I asked how Montini treated the kids, especially Jeff and Paul. Eric said that the ones colleges recruited got special attention and extra practices. Also, Paul, Jeff, and some of these guys hung around after practice to bullshit with Montini. The coach wanted to get kids placed in colleges. Montini told them his dream was to coach at a major university. Then the pros. It seemed that the more players he placed in colleges, the better his chances were of moving up. The last few losing seasons must have driven him nuts. More loss, less recruiting, I guessed. Eric concluded, I liked the guys on the team. That's why I was there Sunday. I've known Paul since grade school. I'm 2 years older than he is, but he was always on our teams because he was so good. I asked about Susan. She's quiet, never bothered me, seemed to be more with it this year. He shrugged. I can't figure why somebody'd want to kill her. I've been having trouble with the other kids. They won't talk about what happened Sunday. They're worried about Becky. She talked to everybody, me included. She wants us to keep our mouths shut. Why? It's hard to tell with Becky. She's pretty weird. She threatened to get revenge on anybody who cooperated with you. She lives in a dopey little world of cops and robbers, good guys and bad guys. How'd she threaten you? She said she'd tell me about the time I borrowed a car last month. You're not back to stealing cars, I said. When he was a freshman, one of the cars he'd stolen had been mine. I told you he wasn't too bright, even back then. My car had a penchant for breaking down at inopportune moments. When it was stolen, it chose to die a block from school. He'd been seen by half the student body either when he'd taken the car while driving it or as he kicked it when it wouldn't go. Rust now covered most of the places he'd managed to dent in his frustration. I didn't turn him in to the cops. I wound up talking to him about it. When he got arrested for the same thing several years later, the cops wouldn't turn him over to his buddies, who tried to bail him out. He refused to call his parents, so he tried me. I'd shown up, saved his ass. I've already mentioned the drug incident, which occurred a few months later. He'd promised to get help. Now he shook his head vigorously. Honest, Mr. Mason, I really borrowed it from a guy. He's a good friend. You don't know him. He told me I could use it any time. I took his word. As soon as he found out it was me, everything was cool. If Becky called the police about it, I didn't think they could do anything to Eric, but she could cause him some trouble if he got arrested again. He was due for a trip to Stateville. He scratched his head. Becky is one tough nut. I think she's dangerous. I waited for him to continue. He tugged on the earring in his left ear, sat up straighter. I've always trusted you from the first time, when you didn't turn me in for taking your car. I nodded. You can't say anything about what I tell you or where you heard it. I promised. Becky's the school's biggest drug pusher. She's afraid with all the cops around, she'll lose business, maybe even get caught. That's why she called everybody. She runs the whole drug operation. I think she's afraid the cops will uncover the whole thing if they investigate the murder. He tugged on a wisp of beard. Rumor has it she sells to teachers. The kids made drug deals in school did not surprise me. I knew faculty members did drugs, George Wyndham being an obvious example. Are you sure she's the main pusher? I asked. Everybody says it. I've seen her deal a lot at our parties and a couple of times in the school parking lot when I came to pick up some buddies. Which teachers did she sell to? He twisted his fingers together, cracked his knuckles in one jerky motion. You've gone this far, I prompted. Yeah, I guess. He rattled off a list of 7 or 8 faculty members, among them Pete Montani and George Wyndham. Most were younger teachers, new to the district, whom I didn't know. Were Jeff or Susan involved in the drug pushing? Not that I ever knew. Do you know anything about how Becky's system works, or where she got it from? This time he got up and strolled to the window. He cracked his knuckles several more times as he stared at the snow outside. Finally he turned back. I hate that bitch so much. You really can't say anything to anybody. I renewed my promise of discretion. I mean, she can take real revenge. I know one guy who crossed her. He wound up with his dad's new Mercedes in Lake Michigan. Somebody ran him off Lake Shore Drive. The kids say it was Becky, but nobody could prove anything. He was lucky to get out alive. He sighed and sat back down. He started to crack his knuckles again. Don't, please, I said. He grinned at me. Sorry. Anyway, supposedly there's this farmhouse about an hour or so west of here. It's like a supply depot or something. Everybody's heard about it, but nobody's actually been except Becky. It really wasn't a lot of help, not terribly specific, and I didn't see how it hooked in with Susan's death, unless her murder was connected with some kind of drug war, which made little sense and for which I had no proof. I'd have to keep asking around. Eric knew no more. After extracting repeated promises to say nothing to anyone, he left. Scott had an afternoon engagement at a hospital visiting AIDS patients and giving out toys to kids, so he wouldn't be picking me up until 6. I didn't want to leave in my car and miss him. I graded papers for a while, finally finishing last week's tax. I began working on my packet of negotiations material. We had a meeting scheduled during Christmas vacation. I'd gotten 5 pages into it when I felt another presence in the room. It was Carolyn Blackburn. Scott stood behind her. "I got done early," he said. "I wasn't sure where your room was." "I needed to speak to you, so I came down with him," Carolyn said. Carolyn stood in front of my desk. Her gray eyes looked grim. Her mouth was set in a firm line. "I got another call from the superintendent," she said. I quote, "Inform Mr. Mason he is not to harass any of the students or faculty about the Susan Warren murder. A school board member has complained." Superintendent Oliver Sandgrace in office. Less than a year. I'd never met. I'd seen him at a distance. All I'd noticed was that when he smiled, he had gaps between upper and lower front teeth. I'd heard he was a former physical education teacher from Farm County near Galena, Illinois, on the Mississippi River. Scott perched on the window ledge. Carolyn pulled a student's desk closer to mine and sat down. I raised an eyebrow. "I'd be happy to meet with whoever's complaining and talk it over." "Boards don't work like that. Tom, you should know that after all these years." "How do they work?" Scott asked. She smiled wearily. "People generally get elected to a school board because some faction in the community is mad about one issue. Once on the board, they discover that it's a lot of meetings about intricate and boring financial responsibilities. Their one issue fades, and they find themselves in the morass of educational silliness, involving state mandates, useless reforms, contradictory regulations, and that doesn't even talk about the federal government's convolutions." "Why do they stay?" Scott asked. "They love to meddle," I said. I explained that most board members learn to sit at meetings and vote for what the superintendent recommends. They aren't financial planners or budgetary experts. They're housewives, mechanics, good people mostly, but they have to rely on those they hire. That's a simplification, but it sums up the basics. What's left is their status in the community. Drunk on minuscule power and minimal expertise, they spend time listening to the complaints of their neighbors. They want to be liked and popular and get reelected, so they tell their neighbors they can take care of the problems, like some ward boss in Chicago. It's a power trip. In some districts, board members call and administrators jump. In many schools, the philosophy is give the board members whatever they want, no matter whether the decision is educationally sound or not. I've known board members who've used their position simply to keep their quite average students in honors classes, and they blame the teachers of those same groups when their C-plus children inevitably fail. Of course, some teachers have caught on to the game. Too, a few toady up to board members, give their kids A's, and tell the parents what they want to hear. We've got one elderly teacher in the district since day one who's made a career out of giving easy grades. The parents love her. As Mark Twain said, "In the first place, God made idiots. This was for practice. Then he made school boards." I concluded, saying some administrators let parents walk all over the teachers and themselves. Tom's being overly dramatic and a little harsh, but not all that inaccurate. They like to meddle to show off their power and to be anonymous and mysterious. They prefer to frighten the accused into compliance, I said, rather than openly confront those who may have displeased them. "That's bullshit," Scott said. "That's life in the education system," I said. "Witness the current situation with Mrs. Twitchel as president of the school board." "Yes, that's the immediate problem," Carolyn said. "I presume Mrs. Twitchel called. The superintendent talked to me. He asked me to meet with you. You're supposed to stop." "The board voted?" I asked. "Can they do that?" Scott asked. Carolyn drummed her fingers on the desktop. They couldn't have voted. They don't meet until next month. Can they do it? I don't know. The message is to stop. Do you want me to stop? It's not my decision. Should I meet with Sandgrace? Try to work it out with him? You could try. I doubt if it would do any good. It's a cover-up, Scott declared. It's got to be Twitchel and her goddamn daughter. Carolyn cleared her throat. I'd say that's a shrewd guess, but the superintendent didn't tell me. I won't hinder you. I can't promise any help, and I can't guarantee that you won't be in deep trouble if you continue. On the way out, we stopped in the teacher's lounge. I called Frank Murphy to see how bail had gone. The lawyers had done a great job. Jeff had been released to his mom around 4. As I put on my coat, I told Scott what I'd learned that day. Practice should be just about over, I concluded. I want to confront Wyndham and Montoni here tonight. The empty corridors echoed our footsteps as we strode to the gym. It was empty. No lights shone. We made our way to the locker room. We heard random bangings, and a few kids remained combing their hair or bundled into winter coats. In Montoni's office, Paul Connellan and a couple of others remained talking to the coaches. I presume these were the ones Eric referred to as the ones who hung around Montoni. Scott's presence caused a minor stir among the kids. He signed a few autographs. I thought our presence seemed to disturb Montoni greatly. George sat coolly thumping a basketball while he rested his ass on the top of a desk. Montoni rushed the kids out and told us he was in a hurry. Dimly lit and oppressively humid, the locker room gloomed around us. This section of Grover Cleveland had been built during the Depression. Rows of gray metal lockers muted the distant sound of dripping ancient showers. The smell of rotting jockstraps oozed into your nostrils. Trophies, charts, and old dirty brown basketballs cluttered most of the flat surfaces in Montoni's tiny cubicle of an office. Montoni wore a t-shirt cut off at the midrip with an ubiquitous cartoon cat on the front. The shirt revealed a quarter-sized mole with hair growing out of it an inch above his navel. He said, I really have to leave you guys. He whipped off the t-shirt. The hair on the mole was the only hair he had on his chest. He threw on his sweatshirt and grabbed his coat from the top of a filing cabinet. Wyndham watched this performance with an amused smirk on his face. He wore a bright yellow warm-up suit. We need to talk, I said. There's nothing to talk about, George Wyndham said very softly. My wife expects me home, Pete Montoni said. You guys can't hide what's wrong forever, I said. There's nothing wrong, and we're not hiding anything, George said smoothly. I can't imagine what you're talking about. Drugs and kids, I said. George laughed and said, Don't be absurd. Pete's face turned beet red. You motherfuckers, he said. George stopped him. We have nothing to say. He reached for his coat, leaned past my head, and flicked off a row of lights, switches. Now only the emergency lights gave a soft glow. The natural dimness became eerie and tinged with danger. George began ushering Pete out the door. You two can stay as long as you like, George said. Just be sure to close the door when you leave. You told me yesterday, George, I began. He turned on me. For once, his voice raised. I told you what? Do you have a witness? A tape? Some kind of proof? I'm not responsible for what you make up. What are you guys afraid of? Nothing, George said breezily. They were 2/3 of the way out of the locker room before I could think of anything to say, and by then it was too late. Outside, the wind howled at a gale. Icy flurries roared by in horizontal bursts. It had to be well below zero. The wind slammed the snow into swirling drifts. We hurried to the car. The interior was frigid, the seat shockingly cold on my ass. Scott started the car and got the heater going. He said, Supposed to hit record cold tonight with another storm. I thought it wasn't supposed to snow when it was this cold. Somebody lied to you, I said. Growing up in southern Alabama had not prepared him for Chicago at 15 below. That little scene in there was a fiasco. I said, They're scared shitless, especially Pete, Scott said. I can't believe a teacher buying drug from kids. That is majorly stupid. You going to report it? I doubt it. I've got no real proof. Scott's Porsche had quickly reached a comfortable warmth. Let's go eat first and come back for my car later. Then I want to try to talk to some parents tonight. I haven't had the greatest luck with the kids. Maybe I can learn something from the parents. Scott swung the car out of the parking lot. I gazed at the cold brick mass of the darkened school as we moved down the drive to 167th Street. A shadow darker than the others caught my eye. It was out of place. I stared hard. "Stop the car," I said. He braked. "What?" I peered out. Snow swirled for a minute, blocking my view of the school. The wind died for a few moments. "I've been teaching here 16 years, and that shadow's never been there before," I pointed. "I don't see anything," Scott said. "It's probably just a snowdrift." I already had the car door open, however. "Wait, I'm going to check it out." I hurried the 35 feet to the wall. I heard Scott's car door slam, listened to the crunch of his feet through the snow behind me. 2 feet from the school, in a valley between two rapidly growing drifts, was a body. Face turned away from me, coat wide open, with no hat or gloves on. With a wind chill factor of 70 below zero, exposed skin could freeze in minutes. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.